Well, go ahead and open up a Bible to Psalm 23. If you don't have a Bible, there are some just under the seat in front of you. And Psalms are very easy to find. Learned this when I was a kid. You just open to the middle of your Bible, and generally you're in Psalms. If you're in Job, or as I heard it called last week, Job, it's Job. But if you're there, you got to keep flipping, and you'll get to Psalms, and you can eventually find Psalm 23. I'm sure most of you kind of your ears perked up when you heard Psalm 23. It is without a doubt the most famous psalm in the Bible. I would argue that maybe it's the most famous chapter in the entire Bible. For years, Psalm 23 has been a source of comfort for people, both in public settings and in private. And so you'll hear it read in public after national tragedy, after when there's a public event going on. You'll hear it read at funerals, sometimes weddings. It's just a public reading. And then oftentimes in private, people run to Psalm 23 in private to read for sources of comfort and life. And beyond that, Psalm 23 is a poetic masterpiece. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of literature we have, really, in the history of the world. And so with that, let's read it, and then we'll get into a time of teaching. Follow along and read Psalm 23 with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It has beautiful imagery, and alongside a confident reminder of a God that we can follow and a God we can trust. Now, it's a bit ironic that Psalm 23 is such a popular psalm to be read in public and private, because at the heart of Psalm 23 is a topic that isn't actually all that popular in our culture. At the heart of it is the topic of authority. Now, the Lord is my shepherd, in verse 1, is a declaration from the author, who's King David, of his loyalty to God. It's a declaration that God is his one true authority. And so to talk about Psalm 23, we have to talk about authority. Now, I understand that my experience with authority may not be everybody's. I am a millennial. I grew up in like the very heart of the millennial generation, right? And so my experience might be a little bit different, but I imagine there's a lot of things, a lot of kernels, a lot of seeds that are true for everyone. And here was my experience growing up. I was taught implicitly often, but sometimes even overtly, not to trust authority. If you look at the books that we read in high school that we were assigned to read, some of the movies that I grew up loving, these stories, the hero is always the person who rebels against authority. They're always the person who breaks the rules, who defies tradition, who moves away from what their parents think is best, and they're always like celebrated for doing it, and it always works out. There was this small series of fantasy novels I grew up reading. They came out right about the time when I was growing up. Some of you may have heard of them. They're about this young boy who finds out he's a wizard. And then once he finds out he's a wizard, he gets sent to wizarding school. It's a book called Harry Potter. You guys might not have heard of it. And they're very popular with my generation because the main character and his two friends are always breaking the rules. And every time they break the rules, they get rewarded for it. It's like at the end of each book, they have this big ceremony. And at this ceremony, they're always kind of cataloging all of the teachers they disobeyed, all of they have this headmaster who's the most brilliant wizard in the entire world. They never consult his opinion when things go wrong. They just always take matters into their own hands. And it's always like 50 points for Gryffindor. That's like, it always works out for them, whether they trespass or do spells they're not supposed to do. So that's what I grew up reading. Those are the stories that I just internalized. And beyond that, some of the stories, the history that we learned in social sciences, We learned about totalitarian regimes. We learned about oppressive power structures, and that we should beware of these. This was all built into my childhood, and overall, it bred a distrust of authority. Now, couple that with the message that was constantly reinforced of personal autonomy. And so, oftentimes, you have this distrust of authority, and then on the flip side, the reinforced message is things like, be yourself, and don't let anybody else tell you who to be or what you can do. Or only you can decide your future. Whatever it is you want, go out and get it. Or we heard things like, listen to your inner voice. That's who you should trust. Find your true self. All of these messages were just reinforced. And I'm not commenting on whether or not those were positive or negative messages. In fact, many of you probably think, well, aren't those positive messages? Aren't those the kind of things that we should be instilling in our children? And just the fact that you would automatically think that shows it's just been ingrained in you. It's just been ingrained from our culture. And so here's some of the results of this implicit distrust of authority that many of us have. Now, there's one that's a positive result. A positive result is that people in our culture are less likely to follow bad or oppressive leadership. Right? This is like the foundation of our nation, is that we rebelled against oppressive leaders in the name of freedom. And so that's good. We're less likely to be duped or to be gullible into following bad leaders, and many of us have been given the freedom or the courage to stand up against that kind of leadership. That's good, right? There's authority that shouldn't be trusted. But there's also a negative side, and that is that many people are left without a guide to help navigate life. Many people feel ill-equipped to handle the complexity and the difficulty of just daily life, about the things like joining the workforce after college and that transition that takes place, of navigating the dating world and how complex that can be in 2019, of the first couple years of marriage and getting established, or parenting, or work-life balance, or having a balanced mental health life. Many of us feel ill-equipped and without a guide in managing the complexity of life. And so here's our conflict. On the one hand, we have a natural distrust of authority and a desire for autonomy. And on the other hand, not equipped to navigate life without an experienced guide. So here's what this means. We need a shepherd, but not just any shepherd. We need a shepherd we can trust. And so David declares in verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd. He has committed himself to following God and putting himself under his authority and leadership. And so Psalm 23 begins with the declaration, and then it spends the rest of the time answering the question, well, then how do we know God can be trusted? Why is he the one? Why is he the shepherd we should trust in? And what we see in this psalm is because God does three major things for us. He provides for us, he protects us, and he gives us a secure future. And so let's get into it. Let's look at the provision of the shepherd. We see this at the beginning of the psalm in verses 1 through 3. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So, shepherd is one of the most common metaphors for God in the Bible. Throughout the Old Testament, we see God often referred to as a shepherd. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is because everybody was familiar with the image of a shepherd. We probably don't know very many shepherds in our culture, but in an ancient agrarian culture, it was a very common job to have. And so there's just familiarity in the culture. People would have understood the metaphor. And then secondly, from David's perspective, he himself was a shepherd at one time. And what we learn about David is that his experience as a shepherd actually taught him something about what it means to trust God and to follow his leadership. And so we hear David describe what it was like to be a shepherd in the famous David and Goliath story. David has agreed to fight the warrior Goliath, And King Saul has sort of questioned, why do you feel like you can do this? And listen to David's response. This is in 1 Samuel 17. Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Okay, go, and the Lord be with you." It's kind of a funny response by Saul, like the way he starts and the way he finishes. Like he's like, "David, you're a little young to fight this giant." And David's like, "Well, I've killed lions and bears before." And he's like, "Oh, well, by all means, go. May the Lord be with you." Do you see David's utter commitment to protecting the sheep? That there's no enemy, there's no predator, there's no foe that he won't stand up against to defend and provide for the sheep. He's saying, God is the same with us. That's what kind of shepherd he is. And so then he lists the 4 ways that God provides for the sheep. He makes him lie down in green pastures. He leads him beside still waters. He restores his soul and leads him in paths of righteousness. When it describes the green pastures and still waters, that's referring to the provision of food and water. But it's not just generally referring to the daily provision of the things that we need, food and water, but it's the experience of these things is restful. The sheep lays down to eat in the green pasture because the sheep is safe. An animal would never lay down to rest, to eat, unless they knew that there were no predators behind them. And so the sheep feels safe. The water isn't rushing. The water isn't dangerous. The water is still. It's safe. It's restful. Last month, my wife Jillian and I and our 1-year-old daughter Rosamund took a little vacation. Now, something to know about my wife is the greatest goal by which she wishes to attain in life is to own a pet cow. Yeah, that's what she wants more than anything in the world, is to own a pet cow. And on my end, she's kind of put the onus on me to make this happen. And I really have no idea even what it takes to own a pet cow, but I do know that we own a 1,200 square foot home in Denver, and so it's highly unrealistic that that's going to happen. And so, sometimes I buy her things that are cow related to try and quench the cow thirst in her. And we got a dog, maybe that would do it, but no. And so we decided to take a vacation. I thought, man, where are there cows? So we decided to go into the Swiss Alps. And last month we traveled to the Swiss Alps and we stayed in a little mountain town that's right under the mountains and right along a cliff up in the valley. And so it's this beautiful, beautiful area. We did this hike. We hiked up into the mountains, and there are these huge meadows, and all along the meadows are just these cows grazing. And they have the bells, around their neck, and it's really just one of the most beautiful things you could possibly see. And if you notice, these are the happiest, most peaceful cows you've ever seen in your life. They're just laying down. They're just laying there, chewing the grass, not a care in the world. They even let you walk up to them and pet them and feed them. They're just the most peaceful sight in the world. That's the image that David is using here to describe what it's like to trust in the shepherd. Totally content, restful, peaceful, knowing that you're provided for. Now let's just stop and think about that imagery and then compare it to your life. Does it line up? Or are you overwhelmed with busyness? Do you feel just kind of under the burden of your own calendar? Or do you ever feel stuck? Or is just navigating the daily grind in our city just providing little rest for your soul? Don't you want a shepherd who can lead you in this way? He makes the sheep lie down and rest because they're safe. And then we see in verse 3, he restores my soul. Now, the word restore actually means to return. It's the same word where we get where we hear the word repent. And so the idea is that the soul is like the essence of who you are. It's like the very core of your being. The picture is that our soul has been distorted or broken or twisted from its original state, and it needs to be returned to how it originally was. And so have you ever heard people talk about or use language such as, I'm just trying to become my true self, or I'm just trying to be the best version of myself, or maybe I'm going on this journey of self-discovery to get in touch with who I am. Sometimes when you see someone make like a major life change, or they decide to sort of take their life in a different course, a lot of the language they'll use behind it is, I'm just trying to find my true identity. You know what that communicates? That we recognize that without a shepherd to guide us, who we are feels distorted, or we're out of touch with it. Or there's confusion about who we are, or why we were created, or what our true purpose is. And God says, well, I'm the one who created you. I know your original self as it is unstained from the world, untwisted from the chaos of life, made in my image. That's who you are, and I actually can lead you to restoration to that person. So what does the restored soul look like? He leads me in paths of righteousness. It looks like righteousness. Okay, so how does that work? How does a restored soul look like righteousness? Now, when you hear the word righteousness, we don't just hear being a good, moral, religious person. That's oftentimes how we hear the word righteousness. And in fact, we need to do some work to untangle the word righteousness as we've understood it, which is generally self-righteousness, from how generally the Bible talks about righteousness. And so when you think about self-righteousness generally comes in two different versions. The first is the one that we're most familiar with, which is self-righteousness is following strict religious authority and then obeying laws or a moral code or a set of values as a way of earning God's approval. And so you work hard yourself to be good enough to earn God's approval. Sometimes that's coupled with a condescension for other people or a pretense or looking down on others who maybe aren't as holy or as religious or as moral as you. That's generally how we view self-righteousness in our culture. A good part of our culture just we outright reject that. We want no part of that. But there's another type of self-righteousness. And this is when you throw off all authority and decide to live as a fully free, autonomous individual. And so there's this rejection of authority, rejection of tradition, just no desire to ascribe to any sort of belief system because it feels oppressive, and rather a decision to live under your own personalized set of values. Now see, this too is self-righteous because you're defining what is righteous yourself. You become the ultimate standard for good and for evil. That is also self-righteous. And so, what's the difference between that and the path of righteousness that God has laid out? Well, God's righteousness works completely different than self-righteousness, both in its rejection of authority or in its religiosity. There's a great definition of biblical righteousness by the theologian Bruce Waltke. I love the way he describes it. He says that the righteous are those who are willing to disadvantage themselves to advantage the community. And the wicked are those who are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. And so what we see is righteousness is not at all about self-preservation. It's about living in a way that leads to human flourishing for all. It's about giving up of yourself so that others might benefit. Now, our shepherd knows the path of righteousness because he disadvantaged himself to the point of death to give life to the sheep. Just as shepherd is one of the most common metaphors in the Old Testament to describe who God is, the New Testament picks up that same exact metaphor and applies it to the person of Jesus. Jesus refers to himself as a shepherd. And look at how he describes what kind of shepherd he is. This is in the Gospel of John in chapter 10. Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." Jesus laid down his life for the benefit of the sheep. That proves that he's worthy of our trust. That shows that Christ has held nothing back from us. There's nothing he hasn't given us. He's given us his whole self. And so we know that his path of righteousness ultimately leads to more joy for us, more life for us, more meaning than any other path offered. It's not to hold us back. It's not to turn us into robotic people who just obey out of sense of religion and duty and tradition. No, it's to unlock more purpose, meaning, and life for us. That's the path of righteousness. Jesus, as our shepherd, he takes weary, broken, rebellious sheep, and he invites them into life with him. Now we see the fruit of following God as his shepherd. David has declared in verse 1 that the Lord is my shepherd, and then he follows it up with, "I shall not want." Or another way to translate that is, "I lack nothing." Now, we could probably all think of things that we lack. I lack a car that I don't have to worry about breaking down. I lack a mountain home. I lack a new mountain bike. There's many things. The list could go on and on and on and on. See, the desire of wanting things is a treadmill that we can't ever get off of. But under the guidance of the shepherd, you lack nothing that you need for life. He's not withholding anything from us that would bring us true joy. Do you see the difference? One, you're never satisfied. You always need to want more. But when you have a good shepherd that you can trust and be led into paths of righteousness and life, there's deep contentment and satisfaction. What would your life look like if you had no want and just said, "I had everything I need"? And so that's what it looks like to follow the shepherd when there's great provision. But now David is going to describe what happens when trusting the shepherd is put to the test. When we're put into a position where we feel vulnerable, and it's much more difficult to trust the shepherd. He talks about this in verse 4. He says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." What he's saying is, hey, I know it's one thing to say that you follow God when there's green pastures and still waters, but what about when the real stuff of life hits? When there's darkness, fear, death? Can you trust your shepherd then? The image that he uses to convey this is the valley of the shadow of death. Now, this was a description of where shepherds usually had to navigate with their sheep. And so David, when he's a shepherd, he's up in the Judean hill country, kind of nomadic out in the wilderness with his sheep. And on the Judean hill country, there would have been a lot of danger. There would have been threats of predators, as he described, lions and bears. There would have been sheer drops off of cliffs that the sheep could wander off of. There was difficult terrain to navigate, unexpected storms, and then there were these deep, dark caves that they would have to weave their way through. And so he calls it the valley of the shadow of death. And this is a beautiful contrast to what he's described in verse 1 through 3. He's just set up this contrast perfectly for us to see the difference. It makes me think of, have you guys ever been to the national park, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison? It became a national park. Its unique feature is that so much of this canyon is just in utter darkness. In fact, there's one section of the canyon where it only gets about 30 minutes of sunshine a day. There's a great description of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison by a historian, and he describes it this way. He says, several canyons of the American West are longer and some are deeper, but none combines the depth, sheerness, narrowness, darkness, and dread of the Black Canyon. And so the image is one of darkness and dread. That's the valley of the shadow of death. Now, for some of you, that's probably a fairly accurate description of what life feels like now, or perhaps a season of life that you've walked through. And notice how David here, he never glosses over the reality of suffering and pain and death that we all have to experience. The Bible doesn't do that either. The Bible doesn't give quick answers or quick fixes or superficial description of a life with God. No, it talks about the reality that we have to go through this as a part of life. This is why he says, even though I walk through the valley, not if I walk or in the off chance that I have to walk. He says, no, even though I walk, it will happen. And just in the way that God never glosses over that, or David never glosses over that, we as a church never want to exist as a place that glosses over the reality of the shadow. I know that there are people in here who probably right now feel like they're in the valley of the shadow of death. Some of you may even question, do I have a good shepherd? Is he good? Does he care about me? Some of you maybe have felt abandoned by God in your circumstances. And then you can compound that with the guilt that often comes with that. Like, I know I should trust God, but it's just too hard. I can't even see him. Psalm 23 has no quick slogans to try to cheer you up. It doesn't have any feel-good advice for you, like have a positive attitude. It doesn't even include a promise that God will snap his fingers and fix everything instantly for you. Rather, what it does give are two very real assurances that there is hope in trusting the shepherd. The first is this: your shepherd is present with you every single step of the way in the valley of the shadow of death. He does not flee from darkness or enemies or harm. Remember, he's not the hired hand who's in it for himself and flees when there's danger. He's the good shepherd who will go as far to lay his life down. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The rod and the staff of the shepherd are his weapons that defend against predators and threats that go after the sheep. And so what Jesus provides is guidance through the valley and real resources that you can tap into to walk through it. And so choosing to trust the shepherd, even when you don't feel it, but choosing and declaring your trust in the shepherd can be a source of great comfort in times of suffering. Secondly, the assurance is that your shepherd knows the way through the valley. He knows the way out. He has walked through the deepest, darkest of valleys. If you study the life of Jesus, you'll see that he suffered immensely as a human. He was rejected by those he loved. He was despised by people he considered his friends. He was eventually the victim of an unjust trial that led to his torture and his death. He is acquainted with grief. He is familiar with sorrow. He's walked through it. Now, as we talked about, Psalm 23 is a declaration of trust in God as a shepherd. But if you just go back one chapter into Psalm 22, the main theme is when you feel abandoned by God. The first verse in Psalm 22 starts like this: my God, why have you forsaken me? That's like a charge against God. And what we know is that when Jesus Christ hung on the cross with nails in his hands and nails through his feet and a crown of thorns on his head, in anguish, the words that came out of his mouth were from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And so Jesus has felt that. And yet, he comes out on the other side of death victorious because God defeated death and raised him to a new kind of life and a new kind of body that can never die again. That's why Jesus has walked through the valley and come out on the other side with life. His rod and his staff were set against the ultimate enemy, and he defeated it. That's a shepherd you can trust. He knows the way to life. And so my encouragement to you today is don't give up. Keep trusting him even when it's painful. He knows the way to victory in life. And what we see on the other side of the valley is once again God's faithful provision. Look in verse 5. You prepare a table, a feast before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And so I've just been praying for you that this would bring even just a glimmer of hope and comfort for you today. And so far we've seen how the poem has laid out for us how having a good shepherd guides us into good and human flourishing, how it gives us a way through darkness and suffering. And now we see the assurance of our future security. This is where the shepherd is leading us. Listen to the confidence by which David says in verse 6, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Goodness and mercy. The word mercy here can also be translated loving kindness. It's a Hebrew word, and it's used hundreds of times throughout the Old Testament. It's the word hesed, which generally refers to God's promise to faithfully love those he leads. It's the security that is in God because he never gives up loving those who are in relationship with him. And so notice David's imagery here. Goodness and loving kindness follow me all the days of my life. Now compare that to what normally follows the sheep, what stalks the sheep. Predators, enemies, threats, things to look over your shoulder. But in this leading, the shepherd's guidance, it's goodness and mercy, loving kindness that follow you, that chase you down, that won't relent. God will not give up. He will not stop chasing down the sheep with his faithful love and kindness. That's what kind of shepherd he is. And the future hope is in this last line, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, when you see words like dwell or house, any of that kind of language or imagery in the Old Testament, it's usually referring to God's presence. It's about the intersection with heaven, where God dwells, and earth, where we dwell, coming together to enjoy God's presence. And so the promise of trusting and following the shepherd is access to the beautiful, good, and loving presence of God, who is the source of life. Now we get a beautiful picture of this kind of dwelling, of what it means to live in God's presence at the end of the Bible in Revelation. Revelation is a vision for the future hope that Jesus secures for us. And this is the description out of Revelation 7. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. No more hunger, no more thirst, no more scorching hot Denver days where it's like summertime, all I want to do is be outside, except I feel like I might die if I do. No. Springs of life. The same imagery that we see in the psalm. Green pastures, still water, provision and protection. And the center of all of this is the presence of Jesus. And so when you trust the shepherd, when you give him your life, when you put the wholeness of who you are under his leadership and guidance, that's your future, and it is secure because Christ has made it secure in his resurrection. That's how we know that we will have that future. And that actually can give you what you need today to press on through the chaos of life. And so we started off with a question. How do we know we can trust the shepherd? Is this a shepherd you can trust? Is this a shepherd you're willing to make yourself vulnerable to by giving up of yourself and following him where he leads? I think this is fascinating. King David, when he wrote this, he's probably one of the wealthiest, most powerful kings who ever lived. He probably has access to more resources, to more wisdom than anybody ever at this time. And yet, what kind of humility does it take for him to say, the Lord is my shepherd? I'm not going to run to any of these things. I'm going to follow God. And so that's the invitation to us today. Humble yourself. Put your trust in the leadership and the guidance of the only shepherd who went to death on your behalf and emerged victorious with life. The shepherd who gives you rest for your soul, who guides you through suffering and pain and darkness, and walks with you through it, and who gives you a future hope secured in his loving presence. I want to invite you, whether or not you've never even decided that you want to follow God and trust him in those ways, or if you feel like maybe you need to rededicate, I want to invite you to do that this morning. And so I just want to read this psalm one last time with everything that we've learned in mind. And I just want to invite you as you hear these words, this beautiful imagery that David has laid out for us, that you would put your trust in this shepherd. And so read along with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Would you pray with me? Father, what a beautiful picture we have received about your loving care and guidance of us as your people. And I want to pray that we would learn to trust you as our shepherd. That we would learn more about what it means to give up often of the path of life that we think we're on in order to follow the only true path of righteousness that you have laid out for us. And God, I want to pray for my friends who feel like they're in the valley of the shadow of death, that you would be kind to them, that you would chase them down with goodness and loving kindness, and would show them that there's life in you, even when it feels like death. And so would you show up for us this morning with your presence, that we might know you as our shepherd, Father, and understand the cost that Jesus gave for us to have this kind of life. Pray these things in his name and by your Spirit. Amen.